Hello everyone! In this video, we're going to be exploring the Unreal Engine Sequencer, which is a tool that allows you to create sequences in Unreal. Sequence is basically a change in something in your scene over time. We're going to be focusing on using this to move and animate the camera over time, but these principles can be applied to pretty much anything which has settings that you can change in the Details panel. So without further ado, let's hop over into the engine and get started. All right, here we are in the engine, inside the scene which I have been creating over the past couple of videos. The goal of today is to take the 3 cameras that I have created in the previous video and move them over time in such a way that I can export those movements, those camera movements, into some sort of cinematic sequence or movie. To do that, we're going to be using the tool called the Sequencer. So the Sequencer is basically a timeline tool. If you've used any sort of video editing or animation program before, you will be familiar with the concept, but if you haven't and you're not familiar with the concept, don't worry, we're going to be going through the basics today. As with most things in Unreal, there are a few different ways we can create a sequence. One way is to right-click in your Contents panel, go to, I think it's Animation. I never really do it this way. Yeah, there we are, Level Sequence. But the other more sort of straightforward way is in the top right, I keep doing that, the top left-hand corner of your screen. There's a little option that looks like a movie slate. And if you click that, there's a drop-down menu which says Add Level Sequence or Add Master Sequence. Master Sequence is if you are creating multiple different levels and you're exporting this really long movie with different cameras from different levels, or you're trying to assemble all of the cinematics in your game into one area. That can be a sort of great way to do those really big projects, but for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on the level sequence, which is a sequence that's connected to a specific level. So if I add this level sequence, it's going to ask me where to save it. I usually create a new folder called Sequences and pop this in there. But you can also, another way people do it is to save the sequences next to the maps, next to the scenes or levels that they correspond to. So you could save it in your maps folder, but for me it just makes more sense to save sequences inside its own sequence folder. I'm going to call this SEQ for sequence _ hills, but you name yours whatever makes sense to you. Once I've created this level sequence, you'll have a sequencer window which pops up. By default, my window is taking up quite a lot of space. It was all the way across the screen. So usually what I do is dock the sequencer window next to the content browser, because it's unlikely you'll have them both open at the same time. So I keep the sequencer next to the content browser, and that has a nice little a good amount of space for me to use. Cool, so in the sequencer, and if you lose this panel, don't panic. You can always open it up again by going to your sequences folder, just double-clicking the sequence that you want to edit. So this is the sequencer. There are 3 sort of areas of this interface to pay attention to. The first one is the bottom right, which is the timeline area. So this is where you're going to be scrubbing through and seeing what plays in your scene. Since we don't have anything in the scene at the moment, nothing's going to play. At the bottom of this window, there are a couple of controls here. They can get pretty hairy to deal with, but just know that these controls are all to do with showing a portion of your timeline. So this window over here, the sort of scroll bar allows you to zoom in using these handles. And as you zoom in, the numbers on the side start to change, and these numbers are just a representation of what part of your timeline is showing. It can get pretty hairy, so I just suggest sort of playing around with it a little bit and getting an intuitive understanding rather than trying to remember exactly what everything does. You can also zoom in and out of your timeline by holding Control and then using your scroll wheel. So Control and scroll up zooms in, and then Control and scroll down zooms out, and you can zoom far out. All right, so next to the timeline window is the track window. So this is where you're going to be populating all the different things that you animate over time in your scene as tracks. We'll get into that in a little bit more of a time, so let's not worry too much about that right now. Right above the tracks is the third component of this window, or this panel, which is the menu. There are a lot of complex things here, so we will sort of get into those as they become relevant. But the first thing just to pay attention to is what the FPS you are using is. So by default, when I open this project, this has now set the frames per second of the sequence that I'm going to export as 30. Depending on what you're exporting for, these settings will change. So there's no one real best setting. But if you are trying to emulate something that is a film, or you are exporting specifically for film, you'll want to choose something either 24 frames per second or 23.976, depending on what film standard you're going for. 30 frames per second would be more like something like TV or YouTube, and 60 and above would be if you're exporting for slow motion or some specific reason. Generally, if you know what frames per second you need to export to, then you'll be able to set that here. And if you don't know what frames per second you need to export to, 30 or 24 is probably going to be a good bet for you. So I'm making a film, so I'm going to hit 24. And now when I play in my timeline, 24 frames is going to correspond to 1 second of playtime. So frames per second means how many frames in a specific second. One thing to note about that is I think by default the standard time code source is in frames. So if I scrub through my play bar, my play area, this little orange number just to the right of the timeline shows me how many frames through my sequence I've played. So if I play for about a second and then stop, oh, I got it exactly right, 24 frames. So 24 frames is 1 second. In some cases, this might be helpful and useful to you to know the exact frame count of your animations, but more generally, you'll want this number to be in seconds so that you can see how many seconds have passed. And also, if you zoom in, it's kind of difficult to see on this resolution, I think, but these markers, these frame markers throughout the sequence are set in frames. So unless you know intuitively that 24 frames is a second and you can kind of do that conversion in your head, it's probably useful to have these numbers in seconds rather than frames. To do that, really simple. In this frames drop-down menu, right at the bottom, this show time as. Change that from frames to seconds, and then these numbers now correspond to seconds. So if I play, 1 second is about 1 second. And that makes a lot more sense to me. Right now, all of this is in the abstract because we don't actually have any clips to deal with. So I'm just scrubbing through an empty timeline, which doesn't make a whole bunch of sense. So let's add some tracks. The first thing that I want to do is take this camera over here and just dolly it back a little bit. Just bring it back so that I have a nice little slow motion of the camera pulling back on this scene over here. Again, as with most things, there's a few different ways we can add a track corresponding to this camera. The most straightforward one is simply to drag the camera actor into the timeline. The other way, though, I'm just going to undo that, is to hit this track, go to actor to sequence, so that's going to give you a list of all the actors in your project, not project, in your scene, and then choose the camera that you choose the actor. So anything that's in your scene can generally be added as a track to this sequencer. So I will go, which camera am I dealing with? Wide sunset. It's not actually wide, so oh, it looks like I've piloted the camera. So I'm going to go actor to sequence, camera wide sunset, and exactly the same thing happens as when I dragged that camera in. So a few things have happened here. The first thing very important to be aware of is once you drag a camera into your sequencer, by default, Unreal assumes that you want to pilot that camera. So it's put me in the piloting camera mode. So do be aware of that. When you drag a camera into your track, you're going to be piloting, and if you don't want to do that, make sure you just eject from the piloting camera so that you don't make any accidental changes without intending to. Cool. So the second thing that's happened is we now have two new tracks. One is called Camera Cuts, and one is called Camera Wide Sunset. The Camera Cuts track, now that we have a sequencer, we're basically saying that we want to export a movie at some point, a movie to something. And that movie is going to have one active camera at a time. So the active camera is going to be what actually renders onto the screen. This camera cuts bar at the top is now the thing that describes what the active camera is. Because we dragged a camera in, the sequencer assumed that that camera is going to be our active camera. If I drag another camera in, again, I'm piloting that new camera, but that new camera is not put into the camera cuts menu. It's only the first time you add a camera into your scene. By the same token, if I just undo all these changes, have a blank track again, if I drag something that isn't a camera in, like this post-processing volume, no camera cuts track gets created because there's no camera to pair to the camera cuts track. So it's only when you drag a camera in, it's only when you add a camera to your sequencer for the first time that a camera cuts track is created, and that camera that you've added is basically the active camera for the entirety of the sequence. Later on, what we're going to do is create a camera cut and switch to a different camera. So this is a very useful menu, but it can be a little bit confusing the first time you add it, and you're like, what is this? What does this film strip mean? It just means this is the camera that is in that track at the moment is the active camera that's going to export or render to your sequence. Cool. So the third thing that's happened is we've now added a representation of our camera actor into the track, and that is this camera wide sunset actor over here. Once again, because we brought a camera in, Unreal has assumed a certain amount of stuff about what we intend to do with that camera. So there are two different sort of sub-tracks under this camera wide sunset. One is called camera component and one is called transform. And these correspond to the details, transform, and camera settings. So this is basically a way of animating all the stuff under the camera settings panel. And then this transform is a way of modifying everything under the transform settings. So, as I would expect, if I drop down the transform menu, I've got location, rotation, scale. And then if I drop down the camera component menu, I've got only three things. So this isn't all the possible camera settings. This is just these three over here, the aperture, focal length, and focus distance, are the three properties that Unreal has assumed that because we're animating a camera, we want to adjust. If we wanted to adjust something else over time, such as the film back, for instance, for some reason we wanted to change the film back over time, that's not in this menu at the moment, but we can add it by using the little plus option on the camera component to add anything that's in the camera component. So in this case, it would be film back, and we can change the different properties related to the film back. Which means that if I accidentally delete this camera component, which has the current aperture, focal length, and focus distance, if I accidentally delete it and it's no longer there, panic, you don't need to panic because you can add it back by going under the camera wide sunset plus track, and this shows you all the components attached to the camera at the moment, or rather attached to this actor at the moment. Hit the camera component, and now camera component is back. But unlike previously, it doesn't have any of the default settings that Unreal assumed when we dragged in the camera, so I'm just going to add them back by going to track. Which was it? It was current aperture, add track, current focal length, and add track, current focus distance, which is under focus settings, focus, manual focus distance. Cool. And now I've recreated what was done automatically, but just manually, just in case I need to. All right, so now that I have these properties that I want to adjust over time in my tracks, I now want to adjust them over time. To animate this camera over time, we're going to be using a process called keyframing. Keyframing is a very standard animation practice which involves setting a some value at a particular time in your timeline, and then moving to a different time and setting a different value. Then the computer will interpolate the value between the first keyframe and the second, and that's going to create motion or change in value over time. In our case, because I'm just going to pull the camera back a little bit, we're going to want to set a keyframe for location. So I'm going to go to the location track and then click the plus button next to location, which is going to add a keyframe in my timeline where the current playhead is. So this is important to be aware of. The playhead is a very important tool to be able to keyframe and animate because this is where your keyframes are going to be added. So because my playhead was at the beginning of my track, my keyframe has been added at the beginning of that track. And if we drop down location, you will note that this has set 3 different keyframes. It set the keyframe for location X, Y, and Z. Then I'm going to move my playhead to, clicked the wrong thing, move my playhead to further down the timeline, in this case 5 seconds. I want my motion to be 5 seconds long. And then I'm going to move the camera to where I want it to be. So I'll move this back a little bit, All right, so I've moved the camera back a little bit. My playhead is at 5, and then I'm going to click keyframe again. And now I've got 2 keyframes, one at the beginning of my timeline, where the camera's over there, and one at the end of my timeline, where the camera's over there. And you can already see, as I start scrubbing through, that the camera has started moving back between these 2 keyframes. So plus, if I press space, you'll see in the camera view that the camera moves back. These 2 keyframes indicate a change that happens over time. One thing that's kind of inherent to this process, but worth mentioning anyway, is that these keyframes indicate a specific state at a time. So this first keyframe indicates where my camera should be at this time, and then the second keyframe indicates where my camera should be at that time. What that means is that if I bring my keyframes closer together, the change between those 2 positions is going to be a lot quicker. So keyframes which are closer together will create a faster movement, and then keyframes which are further apart with the same keyframe value means a much slower motion. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind if you're unfamiliar with this concept of keyframing at all. I can do more than 2 keyframes. I can add keyframes in the middle. So if I wanted the camera to come out to the side a little bit, I'll add a keyframe there and then hit play, and now the camera moves out to the side and then comes back to the second keyframe. If I don't like a keyframe, I can just hit delete and that keyframe will go away. Obviously make sure that you don't have multiple selected and you're not deleting the wrong one, but that should be pretty obvious itself. One additional tool at this point that's worth being aware of is the process that I've just described has been set the keyframe, then move the timeline, then set another keyframe. So if I wanted to add a third keyframe here, just to repeat this process, I'm going to extend my red bar so that my sequence is a little bit longer. I'm going to extend the camera cut out as well, just so that this camera covers the entire sequence. And I'm going to add a third keyframe. So I'm going to add a third keyframe here by pulling the camera off to the side a little bit and then going to this location button, clicking keyframe, and there's my new keyframe. This process can obviously become a little bit tedious, especially if you're making tens, dozens, hundreds of keyframes for your sequence. There is an option to what's called auto keyframe. And auto keyframing is the process of, if a value changes, set a keyframe. This can be a little bit dangerous because you can set unintended keyframes. So by default, the auto keyframe should be checked off. Auto keyframing is this little diamond-shaped key icon. And if you click it, or hover over it, it says creates a key when a channel or property changes. It will only automatically add keys where there's already a track and at least one key. So because we've got a track here called location, and we've got keys on this track, with auto keyframing enabled, if I make any changes to the position of this camera, a new keyframe is going to be saved. So over here, I have no keyframes. If I move the camera, a new keyframe exists. This can be really handy, especially when you just want to sort of shoot through your scene and move your camera around to specific places and not worry about having to move your mouse back here and click add keyframe. But like I've said before, it can be a little bit dangerous if you accidentally leave it on and then later on think, ooh, what if I move this camera over here? And now it's saved that position, and now the animation is all messed up. So just be aware. I would say turn it on when you need it, and then turn it off when you don't. One thing that can be really useful when animating cameras is to use the piloting camera tool. So right now I've been just moving the camera in this bird's eye view, moving things back and forth, and setting keyframes that way. That can be useful, but it can also be very tedious, and especially with this window here blocking a lot of the screen, it isn't the most optimal way. So if moving the camera using the gizmo and setting the keyframes that way works for you, then great, but I want to use the piloting tool to be able to frame my shots and then set a keyframe that way. So I'm going to delete these keyframes, and for now I'm just going to make sure that auto keyframing is off. And I will right click on this camera, say pilot camera, and now I am piloting the camera. Sometimes in the sequencer, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, if you pilot the camera, the piloting will activate, but the locking to view won't, which is a little bit strange. So that's just to say, if you right click on the camera and hit pilot, and then you don't get the black letterboxing that you would expect when piloting a camera. Just make sure that in the top left-hand window, this little orange camera button is clicked. So without the camera, the black letterboxing is not locked, but with the camera, it is locked. I don't know why that happens. I don't know if it's a bug, but just something to be aware of. So now that I'm piloting my camera, I can frame up my shots as I want using the controls that I'm used to, and then hit the keyframe. And now I've got a keyframe here. So then I'll move to 4 seconds, move the camera backwards a little bit, hit a keyframe over here, and then move my camera to position to 9 seconds, and then create a new keyframe over here. And now, if I was to scrub back and forth between my timeline, I've got that motion that I've just recorded set in my keyframes. One thing to be aware of, though, is that in this case, I haven't actually saved the rotation. So piloting allows me to move the rotation as well, but because I'm only keyframing the rotation, it's not storing any of that rotation data. If I wanted to store the rotation data, I would need to keyframe rotation as well. If you feel so inclined, you could also activate the rotation keyframe. But an easier way to do that is if I delete these position, location keyframes, close the transform tab, and just hit the transform keyframe. So this is now going to keyframe all of this transform data. I don't need to worry about scale because I'm not scaling the camera, but it's keyframing location and rotation together, which makes it a lot easier for me to set a keyframe, move, and rotate, keyframe that transform, and then move and rotate a little bit more, keyframe that transform, and now it's saved both the rotation and the position movement. Usually, when I'm doing this sort of camera-based animation, I will enable auto keyframing. But you do have to be very careful, because if you make an accidental adjustment, it's going to save that as your keyframe. So be very careful when you have auto keyframing on, but it can be a very useful way to say, okay, at 2 seconds, I want my frame to look like this. Then at 4 seconds, I want my frame to look like that. And then at 8 seconds, I want my frame to look like that, etc., etc. And then all of those movements are recorded. Great, so I'll turn auto keyframing off again, just in case I make some accidental changes. Cool, so now we've pretty much covered the basics of camera movement animation. Just as we've animated the movement of the camera, we can also animate these component settings. So for instance, if I wanted to pair my movement with a slow zoom in, I could change this focal length, which is currently at 120, way high, what was I thinking? Out from, let's say, 40, 48, keyframe that, and then up by 8 seconds, zoom in a little bit. And now that zoom has also been recorded in my keyframe. So that's the basics of keyframing, and that process can be applied to pretty much anything in your scene that has a setting. Anything that you can open in the details panel can usually be added to the sequence and animated. For instance, let's take this camera movement, and I don't really like this last frame, so I'm just going to click the right arrow over here next to the plus keyframe. If you click these arrows, it'll jump to the next keyframe. So I'm going to move to this keyframe over here and change the angle of the camera to be a little bit more like that, I think. I'm just kind of making this up on the fly. Set that as a keyframe under the transform tab. And I think I zoomed in a little bit too much here, so I'm going to move to this zoom keyframe, focal length keyframe, and pull that out a little bit. Because what I'm trying to demonstrate is that we can forget the camera for a moment and move to our lighting, go to the sunlight, drag the sunlight in. The sunlight doesn't automatically come with a transform component, so we do need to add that transform component by going to the plus track, transform, and now I've got access to my rotation. So I'll lock in the rotation at the beginning of my clip, and then by the end of my clip, I want the rotation to be further towards the sun. In fact, I might even use my... for a moment, I think I'll stop piloting the camera. And I'll use my handy sun gizmo to move the sun behind those hills over there. I'm just going to hit the keyframe so that that's keyframed as well. And now, over the time of my clip, I've got a sunset. I guess my original keyframe was kind of stupid, so I'm going to move my original keyframe a little bit further up in the sky. And keyframe that. Cool, so now I've got this handy sunset. Handy? Nice. Delightful little sunset, which is pretty rough and ready, but the point of this is to simply demonstrate that anything that has a detail, if we wanted to change our post-processing over time, all you need to do is drag that actor into your, track, and then use this plus track option to find wherever the setting that you're looking for in the details panel lives. In the post-process volume, it happens to be under settings, and then all of the options that you have are under there. I'm not going to do that for now, though, because it's a bit of a faff. And I think I've demonstrated the point already. The last thing that I'll say on these keyframes is that you can change the way that the system interpolates between the two keyframes. What I mean by that is if we take a look at the camera actor, for instance, where is it? Where did it go? Here we are. I'm going to just press F in my window to find it. There it is. Interesting. All right, hopefully this will come across okay over the video, but when I play this camera, it doesn't immediately start moving. It sort of eases into the movement. There's a slow start, and then the speed picks up a little bit, and then it's going quite fast, and then towards the end it kind of slows down a little bit as well. That's because these animation keyframes are by default using an interpolation method called easing, or Bezier curves. And the premise of that is that you don't want to immediately just start moving. You want to kind of slow start into moving, then pick up speed a little bit, and then kind of slow down towards the end. And that's generally one of the principles of motion animation. You get more organic and natural seeming movements if things start slow, speed up, and then slow down. Let's take a look at an example really quickly. So I'm going to add a new sphere to my scene. This is purely just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to keyframe the position of the sphere over time. So I'll drag the sphere into my tracks, go to the transform, going to set a keyframe at the beginning of my scene, and then sometime later move the ball and then set a keyframe there. And now when I play between this, you'll see it starts slow, speeds up, and then ends slow again. If I wanted to change that, if I wanted it to be a more robotic linear motion, I can select these two keyframes, right-click on them, and set the interpolation to linear. And this is going to then not start with a slow start and not end with a slow end. It's just going to move as if it was a robot, which starts its motion, remains a constant motion throughout, and then ends its motion at the same speed. Another interpolation is called constant. And what this is going to do is when the next keyframe gets hit, the value will snap to that position. So if you wanted something really stuttery or just to turn on and off, then a constant interpolation is for you. The default, though, is cubic, which gives you this nice slow start and slow end. If you want to get really into the animation curves and define your own curves and create really complex animations, there is a graph editor for you to do that, or curve editor rather, in the top left of the menu. And this shows you the way that these keyframes are interpolating. So if I was to select them and move to constant, or linear rather, there's now the motion starts and stops and there's no easing in between it. But the default cubic has a sort of gradual slope and then a gradual start, and then a gradual end. Specific keyframing animation is a little bit outside the scope of this course though, so this is all I'm going to show you on the animation window. If you are into creating your own animations though, then by all means use this curves editor, explore it in your own time. But for the purpose of this course, when you're animating stuff, it's probably fine to just use these keyframes, and if you want to change the way that the interpolation happens, use the sort of default menu for that. The reason that I bring this up is because my sunset at the moment is interpolating with those ease functions on it. So the sun is starting slow, then moving quick, and then ending slow, which isn't really how the sun works. So if I was trying to create a more natural sunset time-lapse in this scene, I would probably want to change this to linear and then move the keyframes to the beginning and the end of the clip so that it seems as though the sun starts with a constant motion and then ends with a constant motion as well. Because your sunset in real life wouldn't gradually begin and then gradually slow down towards the end. Great, so that's pretty much all that we need to know when it comes to creating and modifying keyframes. Now, the only thing that we need to do is add some more cameras. So I've got this one camera in my scene that is currently active from the beginning right until the end. But I'm going to add the next camera. So my next shot is going to be of this path over here. Drag that camera in, and again, because I've dragged in the camera, Unreal has said, great, let's pilot this camera, because you want to move it, obviously. So this camera I'm going to activate at around 5 seconds and set a keyframe for the transform, move it all the way to the end, and then pilot my camera forward a little bit. And now I'll add a keyframe over there. So this is just going to be another little smooth motion, a little bit forward and with a little bit of a tilt up. If you are creating complex motions, you might obviously want to add the auto keyframing and then set your keyframes that way. But for me, because I'm only creating 2 different keyframes, this is going to look weird. Yeah, so this camera is going all over the place. I'm going to delete those middle keyframes and only worry about the beginning and the end. Great, so that movement works for me, and I'm happy with it. Now all I need to do is tell the sequencer to use that camera from 5 seconds onward. The way to do that is relatively straightforward. In the camera cuts track, there is a plus camera option. Here you have the option to create a new binding, which is going to make a new track for a camera that's already in your scene, or choose an existing binding, which gives you the options for the cameras already in your tracks list. So because I already have this camera called medium path in my tracks list, it's under existing binding. I'm going to click on that, and now I have 2 different clips. I don't know if you caught that in time, but there are now 2 separate camera cuts tracks, one after the other. The first track, it's kind of high contrast, so low contrast, so you can't see. But the first track corresponds to my first camera, and then the second track corresponds to my second camera. So now when I pan between these 2, the sequencer is saying, for the first 5 seconds, use camera wide sunset, and then for the last 5 seconds, use camera medium path. At the moment, though, I'm just telling you that, and you have to believe me because there's no way of verifying it except for exporting your sequence, but there is a way to preview what your sequence looks like. In the camera cuts menu, right at the far right, there is a little icon, which looks like a camera. If you click on that, your viewport is going to lock to your camera. This is going to feel a little bit like the piloting option because your scene camera now locks to the aspect ratio of whichever camera is active. And when you move the sequencer, the camera moves with it. The difference is that I can try to click and drag and move around as much as I want, but the camera is not going anywhere. So this isn't technically piloting the camera because you're not able to change its position. This is purely showing you what the sequence is doing at that time. It's a small distinction, but one to be aware of, in that you can't move the camera while this camera cuts icon is active. But what you can do is preview what your sequence looks like. So if I press play now, it's going to run through and show me exactly what the sequence looks like with my camera cuts that I've set up. So that looks a little bit rubbish because I haven't put much thought into the beginning and end of these cameras. In fact, I might just move this sequence, this keyframe a little bit into the cut so that the camera starts with some motion on it. Obviously, once you are done previewing your sequence, you will want to uncheck that camera to open up your scene camera again so that you can edit things. Oh, the last thing that I'll add, which I just forgot to mention, is this camera locking icon over here is a great way to get focus in your scene. So for instance, this camera, oops, not the medium path, the wide sunset camera, I want to focus on this tree over here. So I'm going to create a manual. I've already got this manual focus distance tab available. So I will keyframe the manual focus distance at the beginning of my clip and set it to where the tree is in focus. And then right towards the end, where the trees become a little bit out of focus, I will set this manual focus distance again. Again, I could use the different, from the previous video, the camera video, I could go into the camera settings, go to focus settings, and use the focus picker to set the focus in this general area over here. Whichever way you do it, it's up to you. Either way, I've now keyframed my focus as well, so this tree is always going to be in focus. So again, just keep in mind that anything you can adjust in your details panel, you can usually keyframe in the sequencer to create really complex scenes with not too much effort. Now that I've set up my sequence and created my two different clips that I want to export to a movie file, the last thing to do is export it as a movie file. The process for that is relatively straightforward. In the menu item, in the menu bar of the sequencer, there is a little icon which looks like a movie slate. If you hover over this, the text says render this movie to a video or image frame sequence. So if you hit that, you'll get the export window or render movie settings window. There are a lot of settings here, but most of the defaults are pretty good. The first setting option is the image output format. So I've only got one video sequence option available called AVI. The rest are image sequences. An image sequence is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to export your frames where each frame is an image. This is often a great way to preserve quality if you're then bringing your movie into a different editing program like Premiere or Avid or DaVinci Resolve. But if you don't plan on doing that and you just want to export something from Unreal and then upload it to the web, video sequence is probably a good choice for that. Image sequence, you're going to have to do some sort of post-processing with it. I don't have any audio in my scene, so I'm going to choose no audio, and the frame rate is locked to the frame rate that you set earlier when you created the sequence. But if you wanted to change that now, you could. I don't imagine why you would want to, though. So probably good to keep that as the default. Resolution, 120 by 720 is not going to look very good on like a giant 4K TV or anything, but for previewing purposes, it's probably good. It helps you save a little bit of time and a little bit of space when uploading to the web. So if you're just creating a preview, then this 720p is probably good. But then if you're making your final movie, which you want to display in all its glory, you can obviously bump that up to HD or 4K should you wish to. The other setting that can be really useful when previewing your work or getting feedback from other people is this burn-in options. I think by default, use burn-in is not set to true, but I would encourage you for this class at least to check use burn-in, because what this is going to do is it's going to give a little bit of information overlaid on your video that can help you get feedback. Especially if you've got longer videos, this is basically going to give you a time code that shows you how long the video runs for. And we can use that time code to say, oh, at minute 120, you made this choice with the camera. You know, have you thought about doing something else? So I encourage you to use the burn-in settings, but obviously you don't want them for any final outputs because it's going to be a lot of extra information on screen. I'll export this with burn-in on, just so that you can see what it looks like, and then you can make the decision to keep it on or not. The rest of these settings are pretty good by default. There's some compression options under the video settings. General is where you want to save this to. The default saves it into the project folder itself, but perhaps you have an external drive you want to save it to, so you can change where the video is saved to using this option. Sequence and cinematic, it's worth just making sure that these settings are checked, which is going to make sure that your movie exports in the highest quality possible, but unless you've changed it, the default is the right way. And then animation is a tab that we don't have to worry about just yet. We might look into this in a future video, but for now, just leave the animation as it is. And then all you need to do is hit capture. If you haven't saved your scene in a while, it'll ask you to save your scene. And once you've captured, you should be good to go. Alright, so here's my video folder, and this is where it's worth mentioning that it is worth checking your renders, because every once in a while, and I don't 100% know why this happens, but every once in a while, especially when you're rendering for the first time from a project, oh my god, what's happening here? Okay, my Windows video player is acting a bit stupid, but every once in a while, your landscape can get kind of messed up in the render. So I've got this sort of blocky nonsense happening, which is almost as if I recognize it as the landscape isn't fully loading. So sometimes when exporting your movies for the first time, there can be a little bit of a mess in your landscape. Don't panic if this happens, because in my experience, a second render, so if you just hit capture again and Unreal renders really quickly, the second time round, the landscape has been kind of kicked into gear and it'll look like you intended to. So I've done that again, and now my second movie, once Windows Media Player has done its whole thing, should look a lot better. There we are. So I'm not 100% sure why that happens, but the first time round, I got a blocky landscape, and then the second time round, it looks a lot better, like it's supposed to. This is where I'll just point out what the burn-in, the overlay, looks like. It just gives you a little bit of information about the shot, about the time code, which is at the bottom. You probably can't see that, and a bunch of different settings for this sequence. So that's super useful for other people to be able to say, hey, that time that you were using the 25mm camera didn't work out so well, or love that shot at time 30 seconds. It's a small detail, but it can be useful. Great, and once you've done that, your video is ready to use in wherever you want it to be used. Oh, the last setting, one setting I should point out under General, which I skipped over earlier, is if you hit General and then Advanced, there is an option to overwrite existing. This used to be default. I'm not sure if it is anymore. But obviously, if you overwrite existing, then it will overwrite whatever file name you had there before. So if you're exporting a lot and you don't want to keep the test exports, check overwriting existing. But if you don't mind, if you have a little bit of hard drive space to export a lot of different videos, I would suggest to not check that, so that you have different versions as you progress. Because now if I capture this again, once that capture is done, I've now got 3 different videos, even though they're all the same. It hasn't overwritten any of the other ones. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So that's it for the exporting. All right, so that's pretty much it for this video. I would suggest that now you create separate clips for each of the cameras in your scene and figure out some nice little animations or motions for them. Also, if you are interested, play around with the sunlight movement in your scene. You can create daytime animations, or if you're only focused on one specific time of day, you don't necessarily need to do that, but it can be fun to just get into the habit of animating things in your scene. To recap what we've done today, we've opened up the sequencer and explored what the interface looks like. We've had a look at the timeline tool, as well as adding tracks to your sequence. We discussed how to start adding keyframes to your scene, either the manual method using the keyframe button in the tracks window, or with the auto keyframe option enabled, depending on what works for your needs. And then we covered the camera cuts track and how that relates to your final sequence. And finally, we covered exporting your sequence to a movie file. So that's it for this video. I now encourage you to explore the sequencer in your own time. Have fun creating different camera shots and varieties of motion in your scene. Obviously, as always, let me know if you have any thoughts, questions, or concerns in the class help discussion board. Otherwise, until next time, take care.